The air that morning in Atlanta was crisp, unusually still for mid-autumn. Light filtered gently through the blinds of a modest brick house on the edge of the Smithfield neighborhood, illuminating a framed photo of a young soldier. Back straight, eyes resolute, uniform spotless. The soldier was Elijah Davis, though that photo had been taken 4 decades earlier. Now at 62, Elijah stood before his mirror, slowly fastening the polished buttons of his army dress blues. His hands moved with deliberate precision, a muscle memory forged through 32 years of service. Desert Storm, peacekeeping deployments, missions the public would never know about. He paused at the final step, placing his silver star on his chest. The medal's ribbon had faded slightly with time, but the engraved metal still gleamed. It wasn't vanity that made him wear it. It was respect, not for himself, but for the institution of justice he was called to serve today. A jury summons had arrived weeks earlier from the Fulton County Courthouse, a quiet but firm reminder that service didn't end with retirement. His daughter Michelle had offered to write in and request an exemption. "Daddy, your leg still gives you pain, and jury duty's just..." But Elijah had simply smiled and said, "Civic duty isn't a burden, it's a privilege. And I still stand, don't I?" By 8:15 a.m., he was pulling into the courthouse parking lot in his aging Ford sedan. The sky stretched wide and pale above the marble facade of the building, a space built to command obedience, if not necessarily fairness. Elijah stepped out carefully, gripping his cane. The old injury in his right thigh throbbed dully, a scar from an ambush 3 decades ago that had left 2 comrades dead and Elijah half a breath from joining them. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with low murmurs and echoing footsteps. As he passed security, even the guards stood a little straighter. Some nodded, others didn't meet his gaze. He had grown used to that, the split between admiration and discomfort, the subtle calculus people made when a black man in uniform disrupted their expectations. In the jury assembly room, conversations dimmed the moment he entered. Elijah didn't seek attention, his presence simply carried it. He chose a seat near the back, quietly observing the proceedings as potential jurors were called and questioned. But something gnawed at him. One by one he watched as black jurors were dismissed, questioned with an edge of skepticism not applied to others. Too opinionated, seemed biased, looked unsure. The reasons were vague. The pattern wasn't. Elijah's face revealed nothing. His silence was not passive, it was deliberate. He had survived commanders who underestimated him, officers who tried to erase his merit with a smirk and a paper trail. He had learned how to outlast storms by listening closely and standing quietly until it was time to speak. When the bailiff approached, Elijah knew something was coming. The man was young, white, with the self-importance of someone new to a little power. "Sir, you'll need to take off your costume before entering the courtroom," he said, half smiling. Elijah looked up slowly, not angry, just measured. "This is not a costume," he said calmly. "These are my medals, earned, not purchased." The bailiff's smile stiffened. "Okay, Grandpa, just make sure Judge Whitlock doesn't see it. He's big on courtroom decorum." Elijah said nothing. He heard all he needed to. When his number was called, he walked to courtroom 2B, cane in hand, leg aching, back unbowed. Inside sat Judge Mason Whitlock, a man whose reputation for discipline was well known in the legal circles of Georgia. Elijah had never met him, but he recognized the type. Born into respect, never forced to earn it. The judge's gaze locked on Elijah the moment he entered. His eyes narrowed slightly. Elijah didn't flinch. He simply found his assigned seat, sat upright, and folded his hands. A man prepared not for battle, but for something far more enduring: principle. As opening statements were read and the first few jurors began to speak, Elijah sat silently. But beneath that calm surface, a current had begun to stir. not of defiance, but of conviction. What none of them knew, not the bailiff, not the judge, not even the other jurors, was that the medal on his chest was more than just metal and ribbon. It was a memory. It was a sacrifice. It was a line he would not cross, even now. And tomorrow, that line would be tested. By the following morning, the atmosphere in courtroom 2B had shifted. It was subtle, like the thickening of air before a thunderstorm. But Elijah Davis felt it instantly. He'd felt it before Miso, in the silence between sniper fire, in the quiet before a convoy was ambushed. The weight of unseen eyes lingered on him as he stepped into the courthouse once more, uniform pressed, silver star fixed with the same quiet reverence. He had made his choice. Elijah had considered leaving the medal at home, not because of fear, but because of caution. Jordan, his grandson, had warned him over dinner the night before. Grandpa, Judge Whitlock isn't just a man with a gavel. He's connected, real deep. I know, Elijah had replied, stirring his tea, but some things you don't put down, especially when they were earned in blood. Jordan, law student at Morehouse, had gone silent then, respectful of his grandfather's conviction, but worried all the same. This time the bailiff didn't speak when Elijah entered the courtroom, but his eyes narrowed and his radio clicked quietly. Word had spread. Moments before the judge entered, a clerk approached Elijah with a folded note. Judge Whitlock requests your presence in chambers immediately. Inside the chambers, the air was cooler. The room was decorated in the colors of inherited power, mahogany, leather, portraits of past justices, all white, all stern-faced. Judge Whitlock didn't stand. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a seat. Elijah Davis, he said flatly, you've deliberately disobeyed my instruction regarding courtroom decorum. This medal, he gestured vaguely, may be of significance to you, but in here my authority matters more than your decorations. Elijah stood tall, hands resting gently on his cane. With all due respect, sir, I earned this decoration saving the lives of 3 soldiers. One of them still sends me Christmas cards every year. I wear it not to make a point, but to remember what that day cost me and others. Whitlock's face remained unreadable. This is not a battlefield, Mr. Davis. No, Elijah replied, but the Constitution I fought for governs this room too. And that medal, it's part of that fight. The judge leaned back in his chair. You're testing boundaries you don't understand, he said coldly. I want that medal gone tomorrow, or you'll be removed from the jury, possibly fined. There it was. A line is drawn, but Elijah had seen lines before and crossed them for far less noble reasons. He nodded slowly. I hear you, Your Honor. He didn't say yes. That evening, Elijah returned to his home in Smithfield to find Michelle pacing the living room. Daddy, Jordan told me, you're going to get in real trouble with this judge. You've seen how these systems protect their own. Elijah placed his hat on the hook by the door. I'm not trying to make trouble. You wearing that medal is already trouble to men like Whitlock, she snapped. They don't want to see black men who've bled for this country and still walk tall. She wasn't wrong. Before he could respond, the phone rang. It was George Matthews, a Vietnam veteran from the local VFW chapter. Don't you take that star off, Elijah. We're behind you. And so's the story. Confused, Elijah asked, what story? George chuckled. You don't know yet? Some young reporter, Olivia something, ran a piece online. Veteran told to remove medal by local judge. Went viral. My nephew in Chicago sent it to me. Elijah sat down slowly, the weight of a new reality sinking in. This wasn't just a quiet confrontation anymore. His phone rang again, then again. Messages from strangers. Veterans, mothers, lawyers, all echoing the same thing. Stand your ground, son. Meanwhile, across town, Olivia Tran refreshed the homepage of the Atlanta Tribune. The piece was gaining traction faster than she'd expected. She hadn't planned to publish so soon, But the moment she saw Elijah leave the courtroom, upright, composed, silently burning, she knew something important had happened. She'd spoken to two clerks anonymously. Both had confirmed the same thing. Judge Whitlock didn't like disruptions, and an older black veteran in full dress uniform, commanding silent respect in his courtroom, that was a disruption. Olivia sipped her coffee, stared at her screen, and whispered, "This man didn't ask to be a symbol, but he might just become one." By sunrise the next day, Elijah Davis's name was no longer just whispered in legal corners. It was trending on social media. The article Olivia Tran published had caught like dry grass under a matchstick. Judge orders decorated veteran to remove medal, refuses. Veterans across the country began weighing in, from TikTok to Twitter to cable news. Some recorded themselves saluting in uniform, medals on display. Others mailed in handwritten letters addressed simply, Elijah Davis, Atlanta. But inside the concrete walls of the Fulton County Courthouse, Judge Mason Whitlock was unmoved and quietly furious. In the judge's chambers, the conversation was no longer about medals. It was about optics, pressure. "This isn't about decorum anymore," Whitlock hissed to his clerk. "This man has undermined my courtroom, my authority." "In the media?" the clerk asked cautiously. "Let them howl. This city still respects order." He meant control. That morning, Whitlock escalated. He doubled Elijah's contempt, fined a $2,000, and issued a formal warning. Any further defiance would result in disqualification and referral for judicial review. The irony was lost on no one. Meanwhile, Elijah sat in his kitchen, still in uniform. The pain in his leg pulsed, but sharper now was the ache in his chest. Not physical, but historical. He'd seen this before, not with robes and gavels, but with promotions denied, dismissals unexplained, and officers who couldn't say his name without tightening their jaw. The phone rang again. "Mr. Davis?" "Yes." "This is Celeste Monroe, civil rights attorney with Monroe and Parrish. I read Olivia Tran's article. I believe what you're facing is both illegal and unconstitutional. We'd like to represent you, pro bono." Elijah blinked. "That's generous, Ms. Monroe. But you should know the judge has powerful friends and a long reach." Celeste's voice didn't waver. "So do I. And mine don't wear robes, they write federal law." Across town, Jordan Davis was already assembling a plan of his own. His apartment floor was covered in printouts, jury selection records, case transcripts, demographic breakdowns. He had skipped classes at Morehouse that morning to pull data on Judge Whitlock's last 5 years of rulings. The results were staggering. Black jurors were dismissed at triple the rate of white jurors. Sentences for black defendants averaged 40% longer, even with similar charges and records. "This isn't just about Grandpa," Jordan muttered. "This is a pattern." With a few clicks, he created a Google Drive folder titled Project Whitlock, then shared it with law school contacts across the country. Within hours, students from Howard, Georgetown, NYU began uploading case files, analysis, court notes. They weren't just defending Elijah anymore. They were building a case against the system that tried to erase him. That same afternoon, Elijah walked into his neighborhood grocery store, the same place he'd shopped in for 20 years. The same cashier, same friendly nods. Except today, the manager avoided his eyes. "Mr. Davis, I'm sorry, sir, but we've been instructed to revoke your credit account. Some concerns about recent publicity." Elijah didn't speak. He simply nodded, paid cash, and left. Another silent door quietly closed. At home, he found his military pension payment had been delayed, marked pending review in the VA system. When he called, the clerk on the line mumbled something about administrative flags and put him on indefinite hold. The message was clear: withdraw, or we will unravel you from every direction. But Elijah didn't flinch. Instead, he drafted a statement. Just one paragraph, handwritten. Olivia published it as is. I did not ask for this battle, but I will not remove the symbol of sacrifice worn by so many who can no longer speak for themselves. If this makes me a threat to power, so be it. My silence was never compliance. It was patience, and that patience has run its course. The response was electric. A dozen retired generals signed an open letter demanding an investigation. Veterans groups launched the hashtag #StandWithElijah. Protesters stood outside the courthouse in full uniform, medals gleaming, and in towns across America, veterans began walking into courtrooms, wearing every medal they ever earned. Inside his chambers, Whitlock stared at a pile of printed headlines. He wasn't afraid. He was cornered. And men like Whitlock don't retreat. They retaliate. The next morning, Elijah Davis was served with a civil lawsuit, defamation and incitement against a sitting judge, filed personally by Judge Mason Whitlock. The demand, $3 million in damages. Rain struck the windows of Olivia Tran's small downtown newsroom in steady taps as she reviewed the newest document leak. Inside her laptop glowed a growing folder titled Whitlock Internal. It had started with an anonymous tip, a former courthouse clerk who simply wrote, "Check jury memos, you'll see what he's doing." What Olivia found was more than bias. It was blueprinted discrimination. Email chains between Judge Mason Whitlock and senior court staff, stretching back years, revealed coded language that was no longer ambiguous. Vet these jurors, avoid unstable demographics. Too many outliers on the panel. Balance it. You know what I mean? Run the list again. But the most damning piece came 3 days after Elijah Davis was removed from the jury pool. A voice memo hidden deep in the digital record, accidentally recorded by the court's dictation software. Whitlock's voice was unmistakable. That old soldier thinks a medal makes him untouchable. These people always want to be seen. It's not 1965 anymore. They need to learn their place. Olivia sat back in her chair. The words made her physically ill, but she knew this was the moment. She reached for her phone. Across town, Elijah sat at the dining table in silence, flipping through a scrapbook of letters. Dozens had arrived, handwritten notes from strangers, many from fellow veterans, some enclosed ribbons. One came with a purple heart tucked inside and a note. You carried a man out of the fire. I just carried boxes. You earned this more than I did. Sergeant Delaney, retired. Michelle entered the room with worry etched across her face. Daddy, Jordan just got pulled over again for the 3rd time this week. No ticket, just random stops. Elijah didn't answer right away. They want to break us, he finally said. Piece by piece, then the doorbell rang. Olivia stood in the rain, soaked, holding a flash drive. You need to see this. The next day, the Atlanta Tribune published her expose, The Court of Whitlock, Discrimination, Power, and the Price of Silence. The article hit harder than even Olivia had imagined. Within hours, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division announced a formal inquiry. The FBI opened a preliminary investigation into patterns of jury manipulation and racial bias. National networks picked up the story. CBS, NPR, The Guardian, all led with Elijah's photo in dress uniform, cane in hand, eyes steady. A retired Supreme Court justice issued a public statement calling Whitlock's actions a grave violation of both law and moral duty. The audio clip went viral. Hashtag surged again. Silver Star silenced, judge, without justice, let veterans stand. But not all reactions came from outside. Inside the courthouse, 3 former clerks stepped forward publicly. Under legal protection, they confirmed what Olivia had suggested. Whitlock's courtroom operated under a filter system. Jurors were discreetly flagged and dismissed based on race, perceived background, or non-traditional appearance. One clerk, Melissa Saunders, had even kept copies of redacted jury notes, highlighting instability, emotionalism, or lack of trustworthiness beside Black or Latino names. The same notes marked white jurors as reasonable, solid, or composed. The pattern was unmistakable. The intent, undeniable. Meanwhile, Whitlock, sensing his control slipping, doubled down. He appeared on a local conservative station, calling the media storm a politically motivated attack, accusing Elijah of weaponizing his military status for personal glory. But the public wasn't buying it, and neither was the Georgia Judicial Ethics Committee, which by week's end had formally suspended Whitlock pending full review. For the first time in decades, Judge Mason Whitlock would not take the bench. In the midst of it all, Elijah was admitted to the VA hospital after collapsing from pain in his leg. A bullet fragment, long dormant, had shifted dangerously close to a nerve. The stress of weeks of retaliation had taken its toll. But the day after his admission, something extraordinary happened. Outside the hospital, a crowd began to form. Quiet, respectful. Dozens of veterans, Black, white, Latino, Asian, Indigenous, stood in silent vigil, wearing their medals. No chants, no signs, just presence. Inside his hospital room, Elijah turned to Jordan and whispered, "They didn't just come for me." "No," Jordan replied, eyes misting. "They came with you." And still more was coming. Olivia had just received one last message, a sealed packet from a former county administrator. Inside was records of real estate partnerships tied to Whitlock, evidence of leniency toward developers who funded his campaign, rulings against families, mostly Black, pushed out of gentrifying neighborhoods. This wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about a judge who built an empire of silence and a veteran who refused to remain invisible. The false sunlight poured gently across the white facade of the Capitol as Elijah Davis was wheeled into the hearing room. He wore no hat, no full uniform, just a navy blue jacket with one small, gleaming detail pinned to his chest, the silver star catching the light like it had something left to say. Members of Congress, the press, and spectators fell silent as he entered. Some had seen the viral footage. Others had read the testimony. But none had been in that courtroom the day he stood up, not against a man, but against a system that mistook silence for weakness. Elijah's testimony lasted just under 12 minutes. He didn't speak like a victim. He didn't grandstand. He spoke plainly, like a man who had carried the weight of war, injustice, and memory without bitterness. "I wore my medal to honor those who didn't come home, to remind the court that justice, true justice, is not about the comfort of the powerful, but the dignity of the people. I didn't stand to be seen. I stood because I couldn't sit down and betray everything I swore to protect." There were no dry eyes when he finished. In the days that followed, bipartisan momentum surged behind the proposed legislation now dubbed the Davis Dignity Act. The bill would guarantee veterans the right to wear earned military decorations in any legal or federal proceeding, strengthen judicial ethics oversight, and require demographic tracking in jury selection. Create legal safeguards against retaliation for jurors and witnesses who report misconduct. Elijah never asked for his name to be on the bill, but when he was told, he simply nodded and said, "Let it protect the next one. That's all that matters." Meanwhile, the fall of Judge Mason Whitlock was swift and absolute. The Georgia Judicial Ethics Committee found him guilty of systematic racial bias, abuse of judicial authority, attempts to obstruct justice through intimidation, and document destruction. Whitlock resigned before being forcibly removed. Disbarment followed weeks later. His former allies fell silent. Golf clubs revoked his membership. Political donors vanished. He watched the signing ceremony of the Davis Dignity Act from a small apartment outside Savannah, wearing a suit that no longer fit, staring at the screen in a silence he could no longer control. At the White House, under a soft November sky, Elijah stood beside the president as the bill was signed into law. Surrounding him were dozens of veterans, men and women from every background, every war. Beside him stood Andre Reed, the young man whose case had first brought Elijah to Courtroom 2BB. Andre was now working as a community advocate, helping other young men navigate the very system that nearly broke him. He turned to Elijah and whispered, "You didn't just help me. You changed everything." Jordan, now a law school graduate, had joined a civil rights legal team investigating broader abuses in the judiciary. Michelle had launched a nonprofit in Elijah's name, the Davis Stand Foundation, focused on supporting veterans facing systemic discrimination. And Olivia Tran's reporting had earned her journalism's highest honor. In her acceptance speech, she said, "I simply told the story. Elijah Davis lived it." On the anniversary of his wife's death, Elijah returned to the Veterans Cemetery. He brought no cameras, no speech, just flowers, and the medal she had once pinned to his chest before deployment. He sat beside her headstone, the breeze rustling softly through the leaves above. "We made a dent, Evie. It won't fix everything. But maybe, just maybe, the next man won't have to fight this same fight. Maybe someone will see that medal and understand, not as defiance, but as remembrance." He smiled faintly and whispered, "We stood our ground." The lesson standing with quiet dignity can shake the loudest structures of injustice. Elijah Davis didn't raise his voice, but he raised the standard. He proved that courage isn't always noisy, and that when power demands silence, principle becomes resistance. Sometimes the most powerful act of defiance is simply refusing to be erased, and sometimes one man's medal becomes a nation's mirror.